This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Well, good afternoon. Welcome to our Family Forum series. It's a privilege to see you here and all of you here, and I hope a few will join you in due course. My name is John Whitty. I serve as director of the Center for the Interdisciplinary Study of Religion here at Emory University, the sponsor of today's proceedings. Our center is dedicated to studying some of the religious sources and dimensions of cardinal issues at the intersection of law, politics, and society. And the center sponsors advanced research seminars, public forums, publications on a variety of topics involving religion, law, politics, and society. This year's Family Forum series, of which this is an important part, wrestles with fundamental questions of children. How do we map the steps and the stages of a child's development, and what rituals and ordeals within religious bodies and what rights and duties enforced by the courts attached to each stage and step of development? What do we do with the massive new incidences and challenges posed by child abuse and rape, by child poverty and homelessness, by juvenile delinquency and violence? Today we have the privilege of welcoming to this lectern two distinguished Emory colleagues who are national authorities on issues of child violence. Violence by and violence against children have become tragically topical again today. Stories from Columbine to Red Lake, Minnesota, from pedophilic priests to Michael Jacksons of the world continue to dominate our headlines and to haunt our nightmares. Our two speakers will address this grim topic of child violence using the binoculars of law and psychology, cases and stories, nomos and narrative. Our first speaker is Dr. Peter Ashe. Educated at Harvard University and the University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Ashe is Associate Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioral Science at Emory University, Director of its Distinguished Psychiatry and Law Service Program, and Senior Fellow in our Center for the Interdisciplinary Study of Religion. Dr. Ashe's work focuses on forensic teaching and public policy development, and he's working with legislatures, agencies, and courts domestically and around the country on issues of child and juvenile violence. He is an author of numerous books and articles on point and has consulted and spoken widely on issues, especially of adolescence and criminal behavior. Our second speaker is Dr. Robin Fiveish. She was educated at the City University of New York and followed that with a prestigious fellowship at the Center for Human Information Processing at the University of California in San Diego. Dr. Fiveish serves as the Samuel Candler Dobbs Professor of Psychology here at Emory University and is also a Senior Fellow in our Center for the Interdisciplinary Study of Religion. She is former director and a current faculty member in Emory's Institute for Women's Studies and also is a faculty member in Emory's Violence Studies program. Her work focuses on early memory with an emphasis on the social construction of autobiographical memory and the relations among memory, narrative, trauma, and coping. She has published numerous articles and essays and is the author and editor of a number of distinguished titles which you have listed in your program. Our two speakers will each offer about 20 minutes of remarks. We'll then open the floor and take questions from you to put to the two of them or to one of them. The speakers will come up in the order in which I introduce them. Will you please join me in a loud, robust round of applause welcoming to this lectern Dr. Peter Ashe, Dr. Robin Fiveish.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Over at the medical school, it's very easy to get caught up in the technical details of evaluating forensic cases and treating patients, and after a while it can feel a little narrow. The Center for the Interdisciplinary Study of Religion has provided a wonderful chance for me to branch out, and I'd like to thank John and the wonderful group he's assembled at the center for the opportunity to meet and talk with an exciting group of scholars. Those discussions have stimulated my thinking in areas outside the usual bounds of psychiatry. So, with a nod to the risks inherent in venturing outside one's field, I'd like to share with you some of my thoughts on the question of the criminal responsibility of delinquent youth. It's a question that lies at the intersection of behavioral science, law, philosophy, and our intuitive understandings of childhood. And I hope that I can further a conversation with those who approach this issue from other perspectives. When I talk today about criminal responsibility, I'm talking about blameworthiness or culpability. The question is the degree to which adolescents, or at least some adolescents, are less blameworthy than adults who commit similar acts. I'm not suggesting that less blame leads to their being not guilty. Rather, the question is whether certain aspects of adolescence mitigate what should happen to them in the justice system. What does an adolescent who's committed a violent act deserve? This question has received relatively little attention, but I think ideas about it nevertheless drive much of our thinking about how we actually respond to violent youth. One reason the question of adolescent culpability has received so little attention is that since the establishment of the juvenile court in 1899, the theoretical construct driving juvenile interventions has been rehabilitation. As the juvenile court isn't so interested in theory in punishing, it's trying to get the kids better. Moral blame doesn't enter in a significant way into juvenile court adjudications. However, the pendulum has really swung. Now we hear, you do an adult crime, you do adult time, where the nature of the act, rather than the nature of the actor, is at issue. Culpability is particularly timely now because of its relevance to the juvenile death penalty debate. And juvenile death penalty, as I'm sure you know, was recently ruled unconstitutional. But similar issues are also relevant to such questions as the conditions under which a youth should be transferred to adult court, what interventions or sentences a juvenile convicted in juvenile court should receive, or what interventions and sentences a juvenile in adult court should receive. So what do we know about adolescent violence? Time does not permit me a very full discussion, but there are a few key points I'd like to raise for you to keep in the back of your mind as we discuss these issues. The first is that the onset of serious violence, and by serious violence I mean violence in which a weapon is used or someone is seriously hurt. The onset of serious violence is an adolescent phenomenon. About half the kids who will ever become violent by age 16. If you get to age 25 and you have not committed a violent act, the likelihood that you ever will is extremely low. This has some interesting implications. For example, if you're talking to an adult spouse abuser and you ask the man, well, tell me when you were violent as an adolescent, and he says, oh, he wasn't, you can compute with about 99% certainty that he's lying. The second key point to keep in mind is that adolescent violence is common. Now here we're working off data largely from self-report studies. Arrest data doesn't capture the whole picture. And these studies suggest, depending on how they define violence, between 30 and 40% of adolescents by the time they reach 17 have committed a violent act. The number for girls is about 15 to 30%. So almost half of the boys and a large number of the girls have committed a violent act. That is, it is hardly uncommon in adolescence. It's a relatively typical adolescent phenomenon. The third point, adolescent violence for most kids is time limited to adolescence. Fewer than 20% of violent adolescents go on to become adult criminals. The fourth point I want to make is the characteristics of juvenile crime are somewhat different from those of adult crime. First of all, juvenile crime tends to be group-based. They offend in groups, as opposed to adult crime, where you have more typically single actors committing the crime. Second is, adolescents don't specialize. They're quite diverse in what they do. They cover the whole range of behaviors. Third, another myth many people have is that adolescent crime is race-related. And the statistics suggest that if you correct for socioeconomic status, the difference between white and African American offending largely vanishes. The rates are essentially the same. This is not true, of course, of adult rates, where African Americans are arrested at a much higher rate. Fifth point to keep in mind is a question as to how much all of this is a mental health problem. We know of arrested offenders that they have triple the rate of juveniles in the normal population. So mental health problems are extremely common in this population. However, the extent to which this causes or aggravates the actual violence remains unclear and needs much more research. And last, I want to remind you of some of the recent history related to adolescent violence. In particular, there was a huge crime wave in adolescent violence beginning in the early 80s, peaking in around 1993. In this period, the adolescent homicide rate tripled. In 1993, for African American urban youth, homicide was the leading cause of death. It exceeded all natural causes of death combined, and it exceeded motor vehicle accident deaths. It was a huge epidemic. This epidemic triggered a wave of great fear for public safety and led to legislative responses which were highly punitive. For example, Georgia, while a little harsher than most, but somewhat typical, passed what's still known as Senate Bill 440, which mandates that any youth 13 years old and up who commits one of 7 violent offenses, the most common of which is armed robbery with a firearm, is automatically sent to adult court, there to receive adult punishment and adult sentences. Since 1993, for reasons that remain unclear, this crime rate has largely dropped. And in the context of what's happened over the last few days, school shootings also added to the sense of danger in public, and particularly at schools. But I do want to point out that despite the school shootings, schools statistically are one of the safest places that an adolescent can be. I want to turn now briefly to Roper v. Simmons, which was the case the Supreme Court announced its decision on March 1st of this year, which highlights this issue. The court found a national consensus against the death penalty for juveniles and said at one point, "Today our society views juveniles as categorically less culpable than the average criminal." The court didn't give a very clear teasing apart of this, what went into culpability, and I want to go through some of it with you in a little detail. There are essentially 3 main threads to the issue. The first is immaturity. Justice Stevens, writing for the majority in Thompson v. Oklahoma in 1988, which was a Supreme Court case on juvenile death penalty, in which the Supreme Court found it was unconstitutional to impose the death penalty for 15-year-old defendants, said, "Thus, the court has already endorsed the proposition that less culpability should attach to a crime committed by a juvenile than to a comparable crime committed by an adult. The basis for this conclusion is too obvious to require extended explanation." Notwithstanding that it was obvious, the following year the court held that executing 16 and 17-year-olds was permissible. And then finally this year, of course, when they found that it was not. When the court took Roper v. Simmons, the professional associations became very interested in writing briefs to support a finding that it was unconstitutional. Most of the major associations, certainly the American Psychiatric Association, already had as a matter of policy their position that the death penalty for adolescents was not justified. I happen to sit on the Commission on Judicial Action, which is the branch of the APA which both makes recommendations to the board as to what cases we should write briefs on and gets involved in what the content of those briefs should be. And it was very clear to that group that we thought it needed to be spelled out in some detail just how immature adolescents were. There was a fair bit of negotiation. It turned out that the medical associations filed a joint brief, and there was a fair bit of negotiation about just how tight we really wanted the science to be, because obviously there were a number of people who felt very strongly anti-death penalty, but the organizations over time really worked to evolve their briefs such that the The science that they quoted was really rigorous science which could stand up to considerable challenge. So what do we know about adolescent development? The first thing is that reasoning, and by which I mean cognitive decision-making, at age 15 is by and large similar to what you see in adults. There were a number of studies of this in the early 90s, particularly around issues such as being able to consent to medical treatment. And these findings were used to support other briefs to the Supreme Court arguing that adolescents were competent to consent to an abortion without parental oversight. This finding presents something of a problem because the associations are now trying to argue that there are ways in which there's immaturity at 15. And the distinction made was that what you have in adolescence is an immaturity of judgment. That one of the constructs that's referred to in some of the literature is called immaturity, psychosocial immaturity, which encompasses a number of constructs such as impulsiveness, the adolescent sense of time, the relevance of the future, the ability to put oneself in another's position, and resistance to peer pressure. Kaufman and Steinberg did a fascinating study of normal high school kids in which they rated psychosocial maturity, and then they also had the youth rate how likely they were to engage in antisocial acts under a variety of conditions. They also did this with adults. What they found was that psychosocial maturity was the best predictor of how antisocial the choices would be that the child made. Psychosocial maturity was a better predictor than age, that while age and psychosocial maturity tended to go together, if you're predicting who's going to be antisocial, the maturity was a stronger factor. The second line of immaturity has to do with the notion that the brain is still developing. When I was in medical school, I was taught that the brain is essentially physiologically finished by age 6. When I joined the faculty, they were saying that the brain develops up to the beginning of puberty. In the last 5 years, there's been considerable research showing that the brain continues to develop into the mid-20s. At my age, the brain continues to change, but the geriatric defendant is another talk. The issue about brain development, I must point out, though, is, I think, more persuasive to lawyers than it is to many in the mental health field. That we in the APA were very cautious about how much you could draw. That while it's suggestive to see that the areas that might be related to judgment light up or don't light up in an fMRI, you can't really go from that physiological finding is correlated with judgment or those circuits. And there was a good deal of consideration as to how strong we should make that link. And in the end, we made it fairly weak because of the concern of whether it could stand up to scrutiny. The court looked at all these briefs, and as best I could tell, there was one sentence that said, "As any parent knows, and as the scientific and sociological studies tend to confirm, youth are more immature." And that was essentially our effect on that case. There's a problem, however, with the immaturity argument, and that is immaturity compared to what? In my job, excuse me, I talk to a lot of people who've committed crimes, adults as well as kids. And I can tell you that if you talk to them about what they were thinking at the time of the crime, you will not be impressed by their maturity of judgment. From a treatment perspective, if you could raise most of these adult defendants to the level of an average 15-year-old, you would consider this a huge therapeutic success. Since we hold imprisoned adults culpable for their acts, and if decision-making capacity is all there is to blameworthiness, once a person reaches a certain level of maturity, and that level probably is way below that of the average adult, he should be held fully culpable, although one might decide to punish differently for other reasons. This point did not seem to make it into the professional association briefs. So we need more. There are two other threads to the argument that adolescents are less culpable. The first has to do with the external circumstances the adolescent finds himself in. My lawyer colleagues tell me that for an adult, in most cases, being a product of what, and I believe the technical term is a rotten social background, close quote, is not helpful in mitigation. The idea is that adolescents, in principle, can change their circumstances. Adolescents, however, by and large cannot. You're stuck with who your parents are. You don't have choice of school. You don't have choice of who the other kids are living on your block. And certainly, to the extent that circumstances outside one's control affect behavior, responsibility is reduced. A critical external circumstance for adolescence is the relevant interpersonal milieu, particularly the peer group. And there are a number of developmental considerations that highlight this. The first is to remember the point that adolescent crime is much more peer-based than adult crime is. So depending on who your peers are, you're much more likely to engage in crime. Second, adolescents as a group are much less resistant to peer pressure. And third, in the culture of the street, violent responses may be a reasonable coping strategy. If you aren't prepared to use violence, you may be seen as a patsy, and it's actually more likely to become a victim. There's also a moral argument here, which is complicated, going into a philosophical realm I'm not very familiar with, but I will pose it for your consideration. And it's this. It's the idea that responsibility has something to do with expectations. Consider a group in which a lot of people smoke, and then consider another group in which very few people smoke. Someone in the group where most people smoke, if they smoke, you are likely to think of them as less responsible for making an independent choice than you are for the person in the group where very few people smoke. This blameworthiness, in some sense, is related to an expectation of how people actually behave. Moral transgression should be deviant. Now recall in this context the frequency of adolescent violence. I think if I'd asked for estimates at the beginning of this talk as to what percentage of male adolescents have engaged in a serious violent offense, relatively few of you would have picked a number between 30 and 40%. Most of us think of it as rare. If you change your expectation that violence is much more common, it becomes, in some sense, less morally deviant. The third line of reasoning, I'll check my time here, has to do with the fact that adolescents' character is still developing. In a case on mitigation, Johnson v. Texas from 1993, the court said, the relevance of youth as a mitigating factor derives from the fact that the signature qualities of youth are transient. As individuals mature, the impetuousness and recklessness that may dominate in younger years can subside. There's a line of argument that bad acts reflect bad character. Now here we need to distinguish between at least two senses of character. The first is the idea that an act is out of character. And so the federal sentencing guidelines for nonviolent crimes allow the possibility that if a person leads a clearly blameless life, is a good citizen, and then does something which seems just out of character for that person, that unusualness can be taken into consideration as a mitigating factor in sentencing. Now we need to look at adolescence. There's a developmental progression of offenses in adolescence. Adolescents do not start with a serious violent offense. They tend to start with things like minor delinquency, vandalism, progress through substance abuse, and then go to aggravated assault, which is generally a precursor to rape and other crimes of that sort. So there's a developmental progression. So in that sense, a serious violent offense is unfortunately very much in character. There's a second sense of character, though, that affects adolescents, and that is our sense that their character is not fully developed. We expect adolescents to change. We expect at the end of adolescence it'll be a different person at the beginning. So, for example, if you put a 15-year-old in prison for 5 years, the person who comes out at age 20 is going to be a different person in some sense than the person who went in. The fact that the person is changing alters what he deserves, although the philosophical bases of why this is true remain not worked out. We want to allow personality to develop in a positive way, and providing adult sanctions doesn't do this. To give another example of how this argument works, my friend, the philosopher Dan Hausman, has suggested that as we grow older, we gradually come to reflect on what we've absorbed from our environment and either endorse it or break away. As we mature, we increasingly reflect on the values and customs of those around us, and our responsibility grows. Someone whose moral and intellectual capacities at age 45 are less than that of most 15-year-olds may nevertheless be held more responsible because he has had an opportunity, despite limited abilities, to build his own life. Even a gifted 15-year-old, in contrast, who possesses far greater abilities, has not had the opportunity to choose a life for himself. To treat crimes committed by 15-year-olds like crimes committed by adults does not recognize that the 15-year-old has not had an opportunity to become an adult and to carry out the sort of reflection that makes his action reflect a fixed character for which unmitigated moral judgment and retribution are appropriate. Now, I don't want it thought that I'm advocating that kids who do bad things should just get off. They do bear considerable responsibility for their acts, and I also recognize there is more to punishment than moral transgression. Among the other issues, we clearly need to maintain public safety. I am fully persuaded that there are bad kids out there from whom the public needs to be protected and for whom relatively little can be done. Although in this regard, it is instructive to look at the research, which is somewhat mixed, but tends to hold that if you punish adolescents with adult sanctions, they recidivate higher, that is, they commit more crimes after they get out than similarly situated youth who are treated in the juvenile system. There are a number of implications, I think, to this. The first is, it is in a certain way an argument for rehabilitation rather than punishment. Now, in the 70s, it was a commonly held statement, nothing works with these kids. The good news is that the mental health fields have come a long way, and we now have interventions which have pretty good data and are cost-effective at reducing recidivism. They're not wonderful, they don't help everybody, but overall, programs such as multi-systemic family therapy, intensive supervised probation, certain social skills training have been shown to be fairly useful in decreasing later offending. In my view, a consideration of what delinquent adolescents deserve will move us away from the punitive approaches adopted over the past 15 years and move to more individualized assessments of just who should receive adult punishment and more services for those youth whom we can help. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Peter. That was wonderful. And my comments are going to reflect quite a departure from what we've just talked about, and that reflects the eclectic and interdisciplinary nature of the Center for Interdisciplinary Study of Religion, to which I'm privileged to be a part, and I thank you, John, for allowing me to be a part of that group. I'm going to be talking today about the Family Narratives Project, which I'm doing in collaboration with Dr. Marshall Duke in the psychology department. As we've just heard, adolescence is a turbulent time. It's a time during which large and rapid changes in brain function and cognitive skills often render adolescents prone to rebellious and even criminal behavior. And while many adolescents experience great angst during this developmental period, not that much fewer actually engage in violent and criminal behavior, although it is a higher proportion than we might think. What I want to talk about today is why might we see these individual differences in adolescent behavior. So I want to share with you some of the research that we've been doing examining protective factors in adolescent development. More specifically, we've been examining the role of family communication and storytelling as a protective factor for adolescents as they begin their journey into adulthood. This research is being supported by the Emory Center for Myth and Ritual in American Life, as well as by the Center for the Interdisciplinary Study of Religion, and I thank my sponsors. Before I tell you more detail about this research project, I want to provide a context for this work by outlining one of the major tasks of the adolescent period, that of forming an adult identity. I'm then going to tell you why we're focusing on narratives specifically and give you some of the details of the research findings. It's during adolescence that children begin to construct an independent self-identity through reflecting on, questioning, and challenging the norms and values of their families, communities, and cultures. Erik Erikson first described the process of identity development in adolescence, and he coined the now infamous term identity crisis. Erikson argued that during each developmental period from birth through old age, the individual faces a particular challenge, a conflict that needs to be resolved for a healthy development to proceed. In adolescence, the challenge is the challenge of forming an adult identity. It's during adolescence that individuals reflect on family values and goals that were implicitly accepted previously. And as the adolescent becomes cognitively better able to think about alternative ways of being, who they want to be in the world, what their values and goals are, they begin to self-reflect on their families, on their communities, and their cultures. So it's a period of reflection and exploration. For some adolescents, this normal developmental period turns into a crisis, during which the adolescent engages in not only rebellious behavior and dress, but actually starts to engage in antisocial behaviors, illegal and immoral behaviors. Yet many children seem to ride out the storm of adolescence in a quieter, more self-reflective way through exploring possible future pathways. For all adolescents and their families, adolescence is a time of risk. Adolescents that are supported and guided through this period of challenge and self-reflection will achieve a healthy adult identity. So what family factors might help protect adolescents against the turbulence of an identity crisis and help adolescents to form healthy adult identities? In the Family Narratives Project, we're examining patterns of family ritual and storytelling that we believe provide a buffer for adolescents as they begin their journey into adulthood. We focus on narratives because narratives are the way in which we make sense of our experiences. Narratives move beyond the simple description of experienced events to provide explanatory frameworks and emotional evaluation of what these events mean to the individual. More specifically, narratives allow us to create a shared reality. We've experienced these events together, and we can share them again through talking about them, narrating them, reminiscing about the past. Through telling the stories of our lives, both to loved ones, to friends, and even to new acquaintances, we're telling who we are, and we're sharing our view of the world. Again, it's important to stress, we don't simply tell what happened, we explain how and why these events occurred, how we thought and felt about them, and what they mean to us. It's through this discussion of emotion and evaluation that narratives take on a self-defining function. Who we are is largely defined by what we have experienced in the world and how we've come to understand those experiences. Importantly, narratives emerge in social interactions. We share the stories of our lives with others, and as we tell these stories and as they're listened to, they evolve. They become more coherent, they become more explanatory, and they become more personal. So paradoxically, it's as we share our experiences and our stories with other people in social interaction that they become part of who we are as individuals. Narratives of our experience are both self-defining and they're also self-healing. Research with clinical and community populations has demonstrated that individuals who are able to create coherent and explanatory and emotionally integrated narratives of stressful life experiences show better physical and psychological health. More specifically, individuals who write about the stressful experience of their lives for as few as 10 to 15 minutes a day for 3 to 5 days subsequently show better psychological health. They show lower depression, lower anxiety, higher sense of well-being. They show better physical health. They show fewer doctor visits. They show better immune system functioning. And they show more effective behaviors in the world. So college students who write about stressful experiences at the beginning of the semester, at the end of the semester, have higher GPAs than students who don't write about stressful experiences. Unemployed businessmen who write about the stressful experiences of their lives are actually employed at a faster rate than their unemployed counterparts who do not engage in this kind of narrative expression. So it's clear that the ability to express one's experiences, especially their stressful experiences, is related to better outcome. The question that I want to turn to is, what about children? How are narratives told within families, and how might the kinds of narratives that are told within families help children in building healthy identities and better psychological health? Parents begin telling stories about themselves and their children even before children can participate in this activity. Parents of infants are already telling their infants stories about their families and about their experiences. Intriguingly, children begin to engage in these conversations very early in development, virtually as soon as they begin talking, although they're not able to participate fully. And it's really the adult who carries most of the narrative content and structure. So for example, very early in development, the mother might say, "Remember last Halloween?" And the child will say yes. The mother will say, remember we had the pumpkin? Do you remember the pumpkin? And the child will say, yes. What did we do with the pumpkin? What? We cut it. We made a funny face, remember? And then the child will maybe laugh and say, yes, funny face. But very quickly, by the time a child is 2.5 or 3 years of age, they're already participating in these conversations. So now when mom says, do you remember last Halloween? They reply, pumpkin, pumpkin. Mom says, that's right, we had a pumpkin. What did we do with that pumpkin? Wasn't that fun? By the end of the preschool years, most children are able to give fairly coherent narratives about their own experiences, although there are individual differences. Children who grow up in families that talk a lot about the past, and in particular have parents who talk about the past in a lot of detail, a lot of embellishment, a lot of elaboration, become better able to tell the stories of their own lives. These children begin to tell more coherent narratives about their own past. So given that children are learning how to form the life narratives through participating in this kind of family narrative interaction, and given that we know from other research that these kinds of coherent narratives are really effective for psychological and physical health, the question that we're trying to address in the Family Narratives Project is whether families that tell more coherent, more explanatory, and more emotionally integrated narratives of their shared experiences facilitate better psychological health in their children. So we're working with mostly middle-class families in the greater Atlanta area with a child who's just entering the adolescent period, between 10 and 12 years old. We're examining multiple aspects of family interaction with a focus on family narratives. Our goal is to examine the kinds of narratives that families tell, and especially to examine the way in which families engage in these interactions. How are the stories jointly constructed by each family member? Who initiates these conversations? What are they about? And when we're talking about stressful experiences in particular, how are emotions discussed? And how does this relate to adolescent well-being? We focus on two contexts, the family dinner time and an elicited narrative about specific kinds of events that most families have experienced, stressful kinds of events that are normative in most families' lives. I'm going to tell you first about our findings concerning dinner time narratives, and then I'm going to talk about findings concerning narratives of more stressful events. So I want to tell you why we're particularly interested in dinner time. The National Center on Addiction and Substance Abuse at Columbia University has found that children who have a regular family mealtime are less likely to smoke, less likely to drink, less likely to use illegal drugs, less likely to experiment with sex at a young age, and less likely to get into fights. Further, these children are at lower risk for suicidal thoughts, and they're more likely to do better in school. Teens that have frequent family dinners at least 3 times a week are more likely to be emotionally content, to work harder, to have positive peer relationships, and to have healthier eating habits. In addition, teens that have family meals have lower stress and they report less boredom, and both of these factors are related to lower risk of substance abuse. Family mealtime is the single strongest predictor of academic achievement scores and low rates of behavioral problems, regardless of race, gender, education, age of parents, income, or family size. Mealtime is a more powerful predictor of child outcome than the amount of time spent in school, studying, at church, or playing sports. Clearly, something very important is happening around the family dinner table that builds positive skills, positive behaviors, and creates resilience to the stresses of adolescence. We think one of the most important aspects of dinner table interaction is the telling of family narratives. Now, dinner time narratives can take several forms. These include each individual stories of what they did that day. So, for example, you come home and you say, oh yeah, I had that math test today, I did really well, or I had a fight with my best friend over lunch. There's also shared stories of the day. So, for example, the mother and the child can tell the father about the child's performance at a school event that the father wasn't able to attend. These kinds of stories bring each individual family member back into the fold of the family. Dinner time narratives also include stories from the shared family past, previous holidays, visits to or from relatives, family reunions, previous houses lived in, and so on. These kinds of stories create a shared history, anchoring each individual firmly within the family, and it creates a shared family identity. Finally, there are also intergenerational stories. These are stories about the parents' childhood, or about grandparents, aunts, and uncles who aren't present, events that occurred even before the child was born, certainly outside of the child's experience. But these stories form a web of relationships in which each individual family member is cradled. These kinds of stories give the developing child a sense of self, a sense of belonging, and a sense of security, each of which helps to build strengths and resilience. So when we actually examined these dinnertime conversations, we did indeed find that family narratives emerge quite frequently, about once every 5 minutes in a normal family dinnertime conversation. For most families where dinnertime lasts between 30 and 40 minutes, that's 6 to 8 stories about the past that emerge during these conversations. The majority are about what happened that day, but about a third of them are about more remote events, building a family history that places the individual child in a secure family past. And there are several important aspects to these narratives that I want to emphasize. First, even when a family member tells a story about their own individual day, the narrative is collaboratively told. And especially when children are telling what happened at school that day, parents, and in particular mothers, ask questions, provide connecting information, background information, and they generally help the child in constructing a more coherent account of what happened in that child's individual day. In this way, individual stories are validated by the family, and they also work to create a more coherent narrative out of this experience. Although, as I'm going to discuss in a minute, families differ in the extent to which they do this. Second, parents also tell stories about their individual day. Family dinnertime narratives do not focus on parents questioning children about their day at school. Parents share with their children what they did at work and at home. And children participate in these narratives. They ask questions, they provide emotional evaluation, usually in the form of negative emotion. Yuck, that sounds awful. But they express interest in their parents' experiences. In this way, these narratives help adolescents to develop perspective-taking, an ability to understand their parents, both as their parents, but also as individuals in their own right, with lives, with relationships and emotions that are separate from their children. This kind of perspective-taking is a critical skill for the development of empathy and identity. Children who are better able to take the perspective of others, to see others as individuals with their own lives, with their own needs, are less likely to engage in antisocial behavior, and they're more likely to engage in prosocial behavior. Third, although most of the narratives are about each person's day, as I said, about a third of the narratives are about more remote events, including shared family experiences, previous houses lived in, stories of past adventures. Importantly, when these topics emerge during dinner time, the telling of the narrative is a joint family venture. These narratives are just as long as the narratives of the day's events, and multiple family members participate in the telling. The family is engaged, and they enjoy this interaction. These narratives are important in maintaining a family identity. So as the adolescent begins to question, reflect, explore, and create an individual identity, the family stories maintain a sense of identity as a member of the family. And this family identity anchors the adolescent in a secure emotional space. So this research establishes that family narratives are a frequent and integral part of family dinner conversations. Around the dinner table, families share the stories of their day and the stories of their past. Moreover, families are engaged in this activity, with multiple family members participating in the telling of any given story, even when it's about a single individual. The patterns also suggest that adolescents are learning important skills and developing a sense of self and identity, both as an individual and as a family member, by participating in these narratives. Families that tell the stories of their shared past around the dinner table are helping their adolescents to create healthy identities. Families that tell more shared narratives of their past have adolescents with higher self-esteem, a higher sense of self-efficacy, and this is the idea that you're an effective agent in the world, that what you do matters. And adolescents in these families also show fewer behavior problems. They show fewer internalizing problems, such as depression and anxiety, and they show fewer externalizing problems, such as aggression, acting out, delinquency. So families that engage in this kind of interaction have adolescents with a healthier developmental outcome. So family stories about the shared past is a positive factor in adolescents developing identity. But as I mentioned briefly, it's not simply the fact of telling family narratives. The way in which families interact in co-constructing these narratives is critical. Although we see patterns across the families that we work with, we also see differences among the families in the way in which they tell their stories. So in addition to the dinner time narratives, we also ask families to talk about stressful experiences that they've that they've shared together. These stories are mostly about the normal stressors that all families face: the death of a grandparent, it's often the death of a family pet, a serious illness. In examining these narratives, we've identified 3 styles of narrative co-construction. Some families share the telling. Each member tells their part of the story, and each part of the story is validated and woven into the story as a whole. We call this a shared narrative perspective. In contrast, some families tell a story with each family member giving their perspective, their point of view, their evaluation, but it's never integrated into one coherent story. We call this an independent narrative perspective. Finally, some families have one family member that takes responsibility for telling the story, and if another family member disagrees with what happened or tells a story from a different perspective, the family member reconstructs that contribution to fit the story as he or she wants it to be told. We call this an imposed narrative perspective. A shared narrative perspective allows children to explore and express their own viewpoints in a safe and validating environment. Indeed, children and families with this narrative style of interaction show higher self-esteem. In contrast, families that promote an independent narrative perspective, in which the child is encouraged to give their own view, but this view is not necessarily integrated with other family members, this seems to facilitate the development of a sense of self-efficacy, that one is an effective agent in the world. Children of families that engage in this kind of narrative interaction show higher levels of locus of control, a belief that they will be able to be effective agents in their own life. So we see positive benefits to both a shared and an independent narrative perspective, particularly as children are entering adolescence. Families need to balance both creating a narrative that incorporates all members' viewpoints, as well as respecting the individual viewpoint that may not be easily integrated into the family perspective. In addition, the way in which emotion is discussed is critical. As I mentioned earlier, narratives provide explanations and emotional evaluations for the events of our lives. Families that are able to talk more openly about emotions, particularly negative emotions, facilitate well-being in their children. More specifically, we're finding that families that talk about feelings of sadness and feelings of anger, who are able to express these emotions, and most important, to explain these emotions, how and why these emotions arose, and how they can be resolved, have adolescents with higher self-esteem, higher self-worth, and a higher sense of social competency, and a more differentiated self-concept. What is important to stress here is that it's not just the expression of emotion that's important. Simply expressing emotion in the absence of explanation and resolution might even be harmful. What's critical is that children are learning that their emotions are valid aspects of their experiences. They learn to understand how they experience specific emotions, as well as how others experience these emotions, and they learn how to resolve negative affect. It's a resolution that seems to be really critical. Our work on the Family Narratives Project has identified family storytelling as a frequent and important part of daily family interaction, especially around the dinner table. Families that share their past through stories, that create emotional bonds through a shared history and a shared perspective, have children who face the challenges of adolescence armed with a secure sense of self as embedded in a safe and caring world. How do we apply these findings to help buffer adolescents against the difficulties they face? At the most basic level, we need to help families understand the importance of shared family mealtimes. While mealtime is the single best predictor of child outcome, fewer families share mealtimes now than they did 2 years ago, and substantially less than they did 10 years ago. The research is unambiguous in the beneficial effects of having a family dinner time at least 3 times a week. So we need to educate families about the importance of sharing their experiences and their lives with each other around the family dinner table. We need to develop ways to teach families to talk about their individual and their shared past in ways that facilitate adolescent self-understanding and self-esteem. We need to teach families to talk about their negative experiences and their negative emotions in ways that help adolescents learn to manage and regulate their negative affect rather than to act out on it. These are not difficult concepts. If we can help families to collaboratively construct narratives, then we can help families buffer adolescents from the stress of adolescence and help these children to form healthy adult identities. Families build resilience through building stories. Thank you.
Both of those were marvelous papers. I just learned so much in the last 40 minutes. I think if you would join me in another round of applause for these 2 fine speakers, this was really a very educational forum. Superb stuff. And now the conversation begins, not over dinner, but conversation with our two distinguished speakers. May I invite you, please, to put questions to either or both of our two speakers. If you would be so kind as to adhere to two rules of the House. Rule number one, for our purposes and for the viewers of the video after the fact, could you please use the microphones which are at the end of each of the aisles halfway through the section? And secondly, would you please adhere to my rule, which is brevity is the soul of wit and the insistence of witty. Please, no speeches, but please put questions pithily to our respective speakers. Who is going to take the first plunge into the world of Q&A? Professor Shepard is coming forward.
A question for the first speaker. Hearing about how adolescents work from you, it seems that you indicated that they're more susceptible to peer pressure, and in certain ways they're more susceptible to being criminals. So wouldn't that suggest, if one's focus is not on whether one is morally responsible, but just on deterrence, that you'd want to have tougher penalties for adolescents rather than weaker ones?
I want to say first that punishment raises a whole set of different issues, because obviously punishment has a number of components: deterrence, moral desert, so on. I was focusing primarily on the moral desert piece. As far as deterrence goes, the research, or the general sense, I guess, the research is pretty weak, is that adolescents are not all that deterred. They don't really have a very clear sense of what will happen to them with various consequences, and that the role of punishment as deterrence for them is relatively weak.
Any other questions? I have one as you are thinking of yours. It's a question to Professor Fiveish. And is it, I never knew that Luther's table talk was actually so important, Professor Alexander. He and I have talked about this, and it turns out dinner conversations are not only theologically good, but actually psychologically good. And I guess my question, Professor Fiveish, is this: is it important that the conversation take place around food? And secondly, is it important that the conversation be regular, or that it be regular with family? That is, could such comparable conversation at Burger King with one's peers have a comparably edifying effect? And what is it about the family, what is it about the food, what is it about the regularity that conspire together to be healthy for the development of the child?
Well, I think from all three of those factors, family is the most important. It's important that it be family interaction, the family shared past, family shared narratives. And there is research to indicate that that's what's critical. It doesn't have to be over food, but why that helps to facilitate it is it carves out a space in the day where multiple family members come together. It's important it be multiple family members, and where they're not doing anything else. They're not watching TV, they're not watching a soccer game, they're not working on homework. Whether it has to be around food, Freud argued that food was an extremely nurturant way to interact with each other, so maybe food facilitates the conversation, but I don't think food is necessary.
Professor Broyd.
Continuing the question for Dr. Ashe about adolescence, is there anything magical about the 18 age? And that do your arguments about the death penalty for 16 and 17-year-olds or 14 and 15-year-olds give credence to the argument that the death penalty is inappropriate for 18, 19, and 20-year-olds? And if it turns out the 18-year-old line is inapplicable, isn't there some sort of fairness problem with saying 18-year-olds can be executed and 17-year-olds cannot?
I tried to lay out three threads to the sort of culpability argument. One, the immaturity; two, the outside circumstances; and three, the issue of developing character. The second of those, the external circumstances, does provide something of a bright line at 18. That is, at 18, the youth are legally able to change certain aspects of their circumstances and make legal decisions that affect their lives in a way that they couldn't prior to that time. So for that thread of the argument, there actually is a bright line at 18. For the other two threads, it's much more on a continuum, and it's hard to make a case that a 17 and a half and 18 and a half year old are drastically different.
If I could press on that, though, if the physiological and anatomical evidence is that the brain isn't fully developed until the age of 25, wouldn't the pressure of Professor Broyd's argument be particularly strong? You underplayed the importance of that anatomical development as a normative platform for pressing arguments about when juvenile delinquency ends and adult culpability sets in. And we have the artificial 17-18 by reason of constitutional amendments about when you could vote and do a few other things. But ultimately, if the physiological evidence is very clear that a person is not fully developed until he or she is 25, shouldn't there be a consequent discount or mitigant introduced into any kind of sentence for that party that does not have full brain maturity at the time he or she performs the crime?
Well, I think one could even extend that it's not even necessarily a matter of maturity. It could just be even where you end up. And that goes to the issue about what do you do with the 22-year-old who is more immature than the typical 15-year-old. You get, I think one could make an argument. There are practical problems there, of course. First, how do you assess really how mature they are? And secondly, if the finding, which I suspect is that, in fact, practically all adult criminal defendants have serious problems in their judgment, what are the consequences of that for the criminal justice system? That is, that I'm not the lawyer here, but my sense is that the law supposes that you are responsible, and if you are not, you have to go a long way, reach insanity or some factor that's recognized as diminished capacity before it will take it into account for a variety of issues.
Dr. Ashe, I'd like to push you the other direction chronologically. I do not know the APA definition of adolescence or the period of adolescence, but does your threefold analysis extend down to age 3 or 4 in an open-ended continuum? Or can you offer us any guidance with respect to diminished culpability of a 6-year-old or an 8-year-old?
I think there, as you push below, I think most people say that adolescence is puberty probably to 19. I'm using sort of 17 because of the 18 rule in the law. I think if you push the immaturity argument down, the big nodal point comes at where youth typically reach abstract thinking, which is like around 13, 14, corresponding roughly with adolescence. When you push below that, then most people are willing to think that they're cognitively also quite different. The problem with the adolescents is they seem cognitively similar to adults, but different in these kind of judgment, psychosocial impulsivity factors. When you get below puberty, then you have to add significant cognitive differences into the equation in terms of considering their implications. But it's, of course, nevertheless the case that, 6-year-olds know that murder is wrong. I mean, it's not like right, wrong in a binary sense really develops at puberty. There's a lot of moral thinking that goes on prior to that.
Other questions, other comments, please.
My question is sort of a two-part for Dr. Ashe. You mentioned the rise in adolescent violence during the 80s and 90s. My first question would be, has there been a significant decrease? And in sort of a follow-up to Professor Shepard's question, what was the result, or why were these teens deterred from such violence if punitive measures don't seem to have much effect on them?
The answer to the first piece is that, yes, there's been a significant decrease since '93. We're now back to the crime levels around in 1981. So it was a peak, it went up, it went down. Why it went up and why it went down are interesting questions. And I don't think there's a consensus of why that is. I'll make a few points about it. The first is that same peak is reflected in adult crime rates, although not to the same extent, and also interestingly, in suicide rates. That is, it seems to be an issue of violence overall in many domains, not restricted to youth violence. The increase in youth homicides has been attributed to increased access to firearms. That is, the incidence of violent events has not changed. The number of violent events has been the same over the last 20 years. What's changed is the lethality of the violence that went up and down. One of the theories about it is, one of the leading theories, but it's not unproblematic, my criminologist friends tell me, is that in the 80s what you had was a maturing, a lot of fights and bringing adolescents into the drug trade with a lot of turf wars that led to a lot of the violence. That there was a maturing of the drug trade such that by 93 this seemed to sort of stabilize and then start going down. But there are other possible competing explanations. With regard to the issue of deterrence, there's not evidence that deterrence accounted for this. That is, not all states develop these highly punitive laws, and there doesn't seem to be a marked difference in the crime rate going up or down in the states that had highly punitive laws versus the states that did not. And also, the deterrence, while adult crime also became more punitive, my sense is from the criminologist that that is not seen as the major explanation. In part because, in fact, there was a delay, that the crime rates weren't known. They started dropping in 93, but this wasn't known, in fact, until 95 when the results came out. It was very interesting. Clinton in 95, when the results came out, the crime started dropping in 93, said, well, that happened because we passed this anti-crime bill, which had been passed in 94, and in fact had not even been, they hadn't hired any cops under it, even when he said it in 95. So you get this funny political play with these timelines.
Please.
My question is to both of you, or either of you, but I was just wondering how much influence media, video games, and have in desensitizing the actions of some of these kids. I get the feeling that some of them don't really realize that what they're doing is real. And if there's been a study regarding the effects of media or violent video games.
Okay, Robin says I can hit this first. So let me piggyback that on to the previous question. If you think that media violence has gotten worse, and you think that that were a significant contributor to youth violence, then you would be hard-pressed to explain why the lethality of youth violence has dropped since 1993. That's the first point. The research on media violence and its effect on people is complicated, but my reading of the bottom line of it is that seeing violent media tends to make kids somewhat more aggressive, but for a relatively short duration of a period of a couple of hours, after which that effect extinguishes largely. You may want to comment on that as well.
I agree with that, but in addition to that, there's a self-selection factor, so that there's individual differences in how much kids want to watch this kind of violence, and so it may be that the kids who are watching more violence and then show this sort of exaggerated aggression response in the few hours after are already different kids than kids who are choosing not to engage in media violence.
I do want to add one other point, though, in the context of the Red Lake school shooting. That I think that there is also, as far as media coverage, as opposed to just you're watching violent fiction, if you will, on TV, that media coverage of actual events may be implicated, particularly in the school shootings, that there really were very few school shootings for years and years and years. And then there were a couple, and then we had a whole barrage of them coming up till Columbine. After Columbine, the schools reacted with these zero-tolerance, high-intensity. There were then an enormous number of threats, but a lot of the response seemed to cool it off, and then we went for a long period with nothing. And then, we have this recent event, and there was one prior one that got a lot less publicity a couple years ago, but that whole phase seems to have gone down. That kind of contagion effect for specific kinds of crime may serve to sort of weakened taboos. It's just, you know, people really hadn't thought of it as something, but then when you're seeing it all over TV, it enters the realm of now a possible activity.
A couple more questions. Professor Shapiro?
Yes, for Professor Fiveish, the story about family narratives over dinners is a very interesting one, and I was wondering if it's possible to figure out exactly what are the elements, or if the research supports that are most significant about that. I mean, I gather that the construction of a certain narrative is important. That's not just let's tell a story about something. It's let's tell stories about what's happened to us or about the past. I was also wondering whether the sense then of situating the child within a particular family history is what's critical, and a way of putting this too is having grandparents around important, people who can tell longer sets of stories? I mean, is that part of the way as well in trying to set intergenerational stories, or is it really more focused on the parent-child interaction?
First, I think that what the evidence seems to suggest at this point is that it's all forms of family narratives, and sharing your individual day is important too. But we're particularly focused now on the more remote narratives and the family history and the intergenerational stories from grandparents, and there's almost no research on this at all. What little we do have seems to indicate that that is really critical, that children who are growing up in families where there's a firm sense of family history and an intergenerational history are really the kids who are doing the best. But ask me in 2 years and I'll have better data for you.
Please.
Just going to ask about religion and to see how religion is a factor, how you frame religion in either of your discussions, but especially in stories of narrative, if you're looking at religious elements in the narrative and how you're evaluating that.
One of the wonderful things about participating in interdisciplinary dialogue, such as the one that Dr. Whitty facilitates at the Center for the Interdisciplinary Study of Religion, is that you start to think about things you never thought about before. I've only been a fellow for 2 years. In our new data collection, we're going to be examining the role of religion and religious ritual, but we have not looked at it at all. And it's unfortunately extremely understudied in psychology.
Ms. Brenner and our colleague, please, last two questions.
My question actually piggybacks off of Professor Whitty's earlier question. I was wondering if, obviously in the context of these kids who do engage in violent criminal behavior, they're most likely not to be the kids who have the dinner time conversations. If we're trying to think about rehabilitation programs that will make these kids better, is there any substitute for that storytelling that goes on that you say is so helpful to kids in forming a positive identity and grounding themselves in, values?
First of all, I want to clarify. Obviously, this is one variable that's important. It's not the only variable, and it's probably not irreplaceable. I'm not sure what I would do, but I wouldn't say that an offender who comes from a family in which this kind of interaction hasn't occurred and now we want to do rehabilitation, I would not say this adolescent is doomed by any means. But I do think that there's an important aspect to rehabilitation that involves helping that adolescent to create a healthy adult identity, and that a large part of that will be through facilitating coherent narratives about their past, even if those narratives might be about a difficult past.
Invite the final question here and give our respective panelists an opportunity for a final word in response to your question and in response to the whole forum.
This is sort of a practical follow-up, Dr. Fiveish. You concluded stressing the importance of teaching families the value of the narratives at mealtime and made a very convincing argument. In your project, what are you suggesting that can be done to teach that to families? How can that be done by society?
There's actually there are already some intervention projects ongoing about this. After the Columbia study, it came out about the value of family mealtimes, including some that are being done by products. I don't remember the name of the company that puts out salad dressings that have on the back of them, they say, you know, have a family dinner together and talk about this, and they give topic selections. Sort of sad to think, but a lot of the families we work with, and they're not families under a particular amount of stress. They're just your normal families. They're so scheduled that they never sit down together to have a meal. I think just getting the message out about how important that is, that, you know, one less soccer practice probably won't matter as much as sitting together as a family and having a meal together. I think just getting the message out is important. There are several websites out now that talk about this and talk about ways to particularly get your adolescents to talk over dinner, although we find that once the family gets together, the adolescents, in fact, when we talk to the adolescents independently, they often complain that their parents don't listen to them enough. Now, their parents might have a different story about that, but I think if you provide the opportunities for the interaction.
But I think it does, as I mentioned, one of the effective ways of treating delinquents is actually a kind of family therapy model. And one of the implications of, Robin, your work is that maybe these family therapists should be alerted to, as part of family therapy, actually building towards this is an extremely useful and maybe relatively straightforward and simple intervention. So I think it does have direct applications for intervention of that sort. I wanted, if I could, to make I had one thought about deterrence during these discussions. There is one kind of deterrence which does seem to be useful, and it grows out of the experience in Boston. I don't know how much you are familiar with it. Boston in the early 90s had just a huge youth homicide problem. And the intervention was essentially this, that the authorities didn't know who did the shooting, but they knew which gang someone in it had done the shooting. They could identify the gang. And the intervention was to get all the prosecutors together and throw the book at everybody in that gang. So if there was a shooting attributed to a gang, if they saw you jaywalk and you were in that gang, you got arrested for jaywalking and they gave you the absolute maximum penalty for jaywalking. Whatever it was, they would hold the whole gang responsible, in a sense. And they told them ahead of time that this is what they were going to do. That kind of deterrence actually worked very effectively, and the homicide rate in very little time plummeted. What the deterrence did was it essentially played to the peer pressure effects and got the peer group to exert the direct pressure on the individual's behavior. And through that mechanism was highly effective. Whereas deterrence, thought of usually at the individual level, doesn't seem to be anywhere near as effective.
Thank you. Robin, final word? Well, this has been a marvelously rich conversation. I've learned a great deal, and I hope you and the audience have learned a great deal. The conversation can continue informally over some snacks and drinks outside. The conversation can also continue by your viewing and sharing with your colleagues a website live broadcast of this, as well as DVDs that will be available after the fact, such that this information can be imparted to other peer groups and family members and others who might be interested to hear the sage remarks of our two panelists. May I invite you, please, to take a look at your program, and you'll see on there a little card indicating and asking you where you found information about this forum. It would help us a lot in sending out PR about future programs for us to have your information as to where you heard about this event and hand it to one of my colleagues on your way outside. I also ask if you would join me in thanking my center colleagues and thanking our friends in the AV department for all their work in putting together this forum and making these events possible for us in the Emory community and the broader Atlanta community. And finally, I ask you to thank me with a robust round of applause for our two speakers who have been so edifying in our conversation today.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.